quick PSA. Oh my goodness. Wow, it spoke. Um, hello, my name is Brian Grider. And for those who don't know me, I'm one of the members at COTAD at University of Indianapolis. And today I have the honor of introducing our speaker for today, who is Carolina. And I apologize, I am so bad with pronunciations and last names, but Castorino?
Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. She is a Lapin Apache tribal member and is the executive director of the American Indian Center for Indiana, or excuse me, of Indiana. She's dedicated herself in becoming a pillar, in my opinion, for the Native American community by establishing access to much needed resources such as food pantries, mental health services, and the People's Circle Recovery Cafe and substance abuse recovery programs, just to name a few that she's been integral in trying to help create. Um, I would say when she's not hard at work doing those kind of things, she's also making sure to be an advocate for Native Americans in legislation, as well as trying to provide better opportunities within the Native American community. So, needless to say, she is a very awesome human being. And it is my pleasure from being a part of the COTAD in the University of Indianapolis to have her present today. So, Carolina, do your thing.
Hi. Dagote, she eat, she la Carolina, she eat, le pa ende, she eat, sha. Buenas tardes, me llamo Carolina, yo soy Lipanapache del estado de Texas y soy de la familia Nutria del Sol. Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Carolina, and I am I'm Lipan Apache from the state of Texas, and I'm from the Sun Otter clan. So I always do my introduction trilingually. I'm not fluent in my language, but we always say in our community that speak as little as you know, but as often as you can, because when you speak in your language, your ancestors can hear you, and so. The reason why I do mine trilingually is as Lipan Apache. I'm enrolled Lipan Apache, but I'm also of Mescalero Apache descent from my great grandmother's side. And then my grandmother was also indigenous to Mexico from Purepecha origins and Yaqui. So the reason why I do it like that is because our community, being a Southwest Native, my grandfather's first language was Apache. His second language was Spanish, being that we were originally colonized by the Spaniards, and we are a border tribe that sits on the border of Texas and Mexico. And then obviously English was his third language. So even though mine's kind of in reverse, I try, to make sure that we're getting that out there. As Ryan was saying, I am the executive director of the American Indian Center of Indiana. I'm what's considered an urban Indian. I grew up off of the reservation. I was born and raised here in Indiana, actually. I've lived several other places. I've lived in Atlanta, Miami, and came back to Indianapolis to do this work because we have a small but very important Native population here in the state. One of the biggest concerns I think that we have right now, which is amazing that we're talking about this topic tonight, is that in so many realms of our just public discourse and experiences, Indigenous people are left out. Often when I attend meetings, be it for something related to healthcare, mental health, if it's something related to any type of statistics, crime, uh, you name it, like no matter what it is, different kind of the disparities that we face. Often when we go to these roundtable discussions, Indigenous people are almost never mentioned. Sometimes we're mentioned as other. Um, and like as Native people, we have like such a great sense of humor. Like I know last year there was like an image during the election or during the primary, not the primaries, I'm sorry, the midterms, and somebody was saying something else, so we all went on and we're like, oh, we're something else, like us Native people. And then most recently it was during Native Heritage Month, and they said Native creatures. And so we take those and we kind of joke about them because we have an amazing sense of humor as part of our resiliency. But this is an issue that constantly causes concerns for us, because when we are left out, that data is missing. And even if other organizations are not serving Native American people, it affects how we're able to service Native American people because there's often just not data out there. Most recently, we've been working with IU Health on a tobacco survey and cessation assessment that is geared towards Native Americans living in the state of Indiana. And we've been working for months on how this survey will determine identity, how we're determining eligibility for filling out the survey, and then kind of like making sure that the questions are culturally relevant, that it takes into consideration the fact that tobacco, not commercial use, but is a medicinal and sacred herb for most Native American tribes, and how we navigate that when we're asking these questions. So after months of working on this, we were finalizing it just a few weeks ago, and we wanted to make sure we put in links at the end of the survey so that people who are considering quitting commercial tobacco use, they have these resources that are culturally competent and culturally sensitive. And the interesting thing was that there were 2 quit lines that were made available, and neither, if you were Native American living in Indiana, neither one of them provided culturally competent resources because there's not enough data to show that Native people live in the state of Indiana. So that's something. It's like this is how the lack of data and being excluded from conversations leads to real world consequences. So as soon as somebody picks up that phone and says, "Oh, I live in Indiana," then that's it. The people on the other line don't know how to go beyond that. It's just that's it. That's where the buck stops. So now we're hoping with this initiative, we're going to drive some results. And that also brings up how I mentioned I'm an urban Indian. So Indiana is what's considered a total urban Indian population because we don't have reservations here. And the saying is, depending on who you talk to, they'll say there are no Native American tribes, there are no federally recognized tribes in the state of Indiana. Technically true. It's technically not because we have the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi. Now, they are considered a Michigan tribe, but their traditional territory is Michigan and northern Indiana, and they do have a presence in Indiana. Many of you might know that they have a casino and some property in South Bend. So they have a presence here, but the general gist is we don't have reservations here. We don't have technically federal recognition presence here. So that means that we're an urban Indian population. And actually, most of the people that we serve at the American Indian Center do come from tribes outside of the state of Indiana. Yes, we do serve some Miami, and yes, we serve some Pokagon. But yeah, a lot of people come from Western tribes. And what's important to understand why that is and how this relates to any kind of realm of the employment world is that a lot of our families were relocated. So during the 1950s and through the 1970s, there was the Indian Relocation Act. And this was a concentrated effort to try to end the reservation system and end treaty obligations that the United States had with federally recognized tribes and some state recognized tribes as well. And so this effort saw people from the government going into these communities and promoting, hey, we have these amazing jobs over in Chicago or over in Pittsburgh or over in Cleveland, and always somewhere far away from where the community was. And there is amazing, I'll have to share the link. There's an amazing propaganda video that was shown during the 50s and 60s to heavily promote this. And it has that kind of stereotypical, what is it called, mid-Atlantic Hollywood type voice describing it. And oh, look, and here is the Indian woman coming to, moving into a high skyrise in Chicago. And so they would go in there and they would offer these bus tickets to these cities that were far away. And heavily promote, we're going to put you through training, you are going to come, you're going to live next to other Americans, you're going to shop at their grocery stores, you're going to have these skills, and you're going to be able to take that into the workforce and become productive members of society and give back to your community. And so people bought into this, and when they got there and they got done with the training, they realized there really weren't any jobs, or that the racism was still so high that people weren't hiring Native American people. But then they weren't offering transportation back to the reservation, and that was how they were trying to end it, by removing people from the reservation. So as a result, there were some tribes that lost recognition status because they became so small. But also what it did was it exacerbated this difference between reservation life and urban Indian life. And so nowadays, over it's about 80% of Native Americans. It's about 78, between 78 and 80% live off of the reservation, with about 72% of that portion living in urban areas, cities. So the majority of Native people today are urban Indians. And I think that's really important to understand, because as a matter of policy, a lot of policies that exist out there are geared specifically towards, reservation Native life, and kind of like the treatises and obligations to these tribal nations. And so that means that the majority of us are getting left out of that conversation. And so that's a little bit of the work that we try to do at the American Indian Center. And our main grantor is through the Department of Labor with the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, known as WIOA. And we are through DINAP, which is the Division of Native American Programming. And so our main focus there is to eliminate barriers to employment, helping people with training, helping people with get GEDs, scholarships, making sure they have the tools, uniforms they need, giving them all types of support, professional development, emergency services, and transportation services. Those are probably one of the most popular ones. And so, but with that come all of these different other areas that we have to find grants for and find resources for, which can include occupational therapy, mental health, healthcare in general, because most Native people, and we'll talk about that a little bit more because it's relevant, coming from the reservations or coming from somewhere out west, may be used to Indian Health Services, known as IHS. Well, we don't have IHS in Indiana, being that we don't have reservations and that we don't have a high Native population. So people come here and they're suddenly without health care. And then it's a process to work to get them covered and help them to understand the system here. We do have some people who will still drive, from southern Indiana all the way up to Dowagiac, Michigan, just for some simple checkups, because that's the closest IHS center on the Pokagon Reservation. And so, so we focus a lot on helping with addiction and recovery services, offering culturally competent resources and services there, and then health awareness and civic engagement, you name it. So that's just a little bit of background, and I'll let you, I don't know if you want to go, if you want to start with the questions or.
I just want to say you said everything I wish I could have said as a student in the most elegant fashion I've ever seen. And no, I mean, serious. As someone that is from Washington State, going in from an absolute culture shock from Washington to here, it's so hard to verbalize and tell people and help them understand, okay, it's not as simple as just uprooting yourself and moving into a new community. There's so many different other factors going on that I don't know. I'm personally just so happy that you're here today to explain and further elaborate on those different kind of processes. I'll go ahead. Yeah, no, I was gonna say that was just my piece before I put any kind of questions.
Yeah.
Hi,
Did you
my
want
name is
to, go ahead.
Sam.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, you're good. Go ahead.
I just had a question. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you identify yourself to other people as like Native American, First American, Indigenous people, and maybe how those different terms are used and like their significance of them.
Absolutely. And what's so interesting is this actually is a question that I think a lot of us in the community are going to be exploring next month as a result of the mascot issue going on and people, I get a lot of questions, a lot of people saying, well, you're mad at the Indianapolis baseball team because they're called the Indians, but you're the director of the American Indian Center. And I'm like, it's not the word. That's the problem because many of us identify like that. It's the concept of being a mascot, right? So with that being said, I get this question a lot as far as like what's the appropriate term to use. And it's very similar to how within the Black community there are people, the majority prefer to be referred to as Black. And then but there are still people who insist on being referred to as African American. Sometimes it's interchangeable, sometimes people feel very strongly about one of them versus the other. Within the Native community, so I personally, if I'm identifying myself, first of all, to other indigenous people, I say Inde, which is how you say Apache in our language, because Apache is actually a Zuni word, which means enemy. So what we call ourselves is Inde. Sounds very similar to Dene, which is the Navajo Nation, and that's because we are both from the Athabascan language family. So we're what's considered cousins because our languages are very similar. So obviously, if I'm identifying myself, I say I'm Inde first and foremost. For people who don't know, then I'll say Apache. My probably next level of identity that I prefer is indigenous. And I say that because I am from a border tribe and from Mexican tribes as well. In Latin America, indígena or indigenous is generally the term to refer to Native people. I I will use the term American Indian or even just Indian, again, usually amongst other Native people because we live in we like when we refer to our collective, not a geographical location, but just our collective across the country or across the continent, we say Indian country. So what's going on in Indian country right now, because that's kind of how we collectively talk about the various tribal nations and communities. I do say Native. I don't tend to say Native American. And that really comes from kind of a semantic debate. I remember when I would refer to myself as Native American, or when people would talk about Native Americans, we'd always get somebody who was being casually racist and say, I'm Native American because I'm native to the US or whatever. And I'm like, okay, that's not what that means. But okay. So I kind of like avoid that semantic argument. And also because it's very US centric and kind of xenophobic for us to think of American and only refer to the United States, because all of the Western Hemisphere is referred to as the Americas. It's Canada, US, Mexico, North America, and then you've got Central America and South America, and the Caribbean is part of the Americas. And in Latin America, that's very much understood. The term American is used to refer to anybody from this region, but it's only here in these states that we make it like this US identity. First Nations, I don't really use for myself. That is definitely more Canadian natives and kind of like Northern natives. But these are, again, so, and I love that question was framed that way, because when we send out our surveys, and even the survey that we're working on for the tobacco use, is I wanted to make sure that people who are authentically Indigenous are answering this question, but also that we're considering people of various Indigenous backgrounds. And so that's one of the first questions is, do you identify as any of these? And it includes American Indian, Native American, Indigenous. And so because you ask 10 people, you're going to get 10 different answers, if that helps.
Yes, thank you. And then also, how would you say that occupational therapists currently practice within these communities? I know you mentioned the Indian Health Services, like on reservations. I was wondering if like there are OT services or how that kind of works within that system.
Yeah, so depending on where you go, obviously where the more resources, like the bigger population or where more resources are. So It's probably harder to find occupational occupational therapy services in smaller communities. Some of the larger IHS clinics, whether they be on large reservations like the Navajo Nation, which is the largest tribal nation in the country, or some of the bigger cities like the Phoenix Indian community there, the Dallas Intertribal Health Center. And then obviously I know there are definitely some in Portland and Seattle, especially given that the Urban Indian Health Institute is up there in Seattle. So with that being said, yes, these larger IHS clinics and communities definitely have those services available. And then it gets a little bit trickier because when you get into smaller communities, more remote locations, these are, unfortunately, it's one of the areas that's kind of overlooked a lot. And so that's something that you generally have to refer out to, and that can be very difficult, especially for natives living in very remote reservation areas, to travel that distance to get to receive those services. And then it's the added complication of like what I was saying with IHS. And to kind of expand on that, IHS stands for Indian Health Services. So this is a treaty obligation that the United States has with tribal nations in this country, that they will provide us these healthcare services. Came over here, you took everything from us, took our health from us as well. So let's let that be an agreement. But so like I was saying, what we deal with when people are moving to urban areas, IHS, you have to be covered. You have to see people through that IHS system. It's kind of similar how except worse, but it's kind of similar how when you have a particular type of insurance and you have to stay within network. And so if you get a referral to a specialist, but your doctor didn't check to see whether they're within network or whether they accept your type of insurance, and then you're scrambling and you may not be able to go see them right away, or you have to go through some hoops, or you have to find a new person and that person may be farther away from you. Very similar, but within IHS, it's definitely the issue is much larger because there aren't as many of these around the country. And then these doctors generally, they can only be used in certain places and IHS clinics. So one of the issues we've had in Indiana is for a long time, for decades, they've been trying to get an IHS clinic here. And when I became director, it's been about 5.5 years that I became director. They had been for a few years prior doing all these surveys. But a lot of these surveys were being answered by non-indigenous people, but who claim to have an indigenous ancestor. So it's like the data was skewed already by not doing that due diligence to see, are these people who are actually coming from native communities, because obviously they're going to have different health concerns than we do. But then also I just had to kind of basically lay it out flat, and I'm like, I'm sorry, we do not have the numbers in this state. We are never going to get an IHS clinic. So what we really need to do is move towards creating a new model, and how can we get visiting physicians to maybe participate over here, and find out how to do that. So this issue of being able to get some basic services, especially under the occupational therapy category, is definitely difficult already for Native people, but it's even more difficult in states like ours, where there are additional hoops to go through. And then we have the added issue that in states like ours, where people aren't used to seeing Native people on a daily basis, that cultural competency isn't there. So if you go somewhere like Phoenix or Seattle that have significant populations, or even in Dallas, these have significant indigenous populations, there's going to be a bit more resources there for people who are in this field to go through training, or get to familiarize with, what are some of these common practices I need to keep in mind when I'm serving indigenous clients. But here, it's definitely an afterthought, and that's why we're trying to help with the data and help with our visibility in the community, so people know that we can be that intermediary.
Thank you.
I got a question for you, Carolina. So as occupational therapists, we're, as a profession, lucky enough to be able to help individuals that we consider clients in a lot of aspects that they either deem important or are a part of community-based activities or just whatever they value truly. What are some ways in which you'd like to see occupational therapy practice within Indigenous lives today?
That's a great question. And actually, give me 1 second because I'm going to pull up something I was looking at. I mentioned I was going to throw some resources out to you. Here's an older one that is something, at least for a good base. It's from a 1992 publication. You can find it on the National Library of Medicine website, as well as, what's the other one called? The American, I want to say it's the Association of Occupational Therapists, like AOT, or American Occupational Therapists Association, like AOTA. But the title of that particular, it's a peer-reviewed article, and it's called An Occupational Therapy Life Skills Curriculum Model for a Native American Tribe. Now, this is tribally specific. And then a health promotion program based on ethnographic field research. The author's last name is Demars, Demars. And so this particular, this was based on a tribe in Canada, working in British Columbia, I believe. And so that's something I would reference, because that is specifically, like, that was the entire purpose of this ethnographic research, is like, how can we bring traditional knowledge and cultural significance into this practice, and when we are, treating or working with Indigenous people. That's one. But I'm going to give you these resources and then kind of expand on that with my own words. Another one is, that's not it. 1 second, where is it? Here's an interesting, and I'll try to, when I get a second, share these links. Terry Abram this is from 2016, so more recent. She is a member of the Laguna Pueblo and is a licensed professional clinical counselor. She worked in the field of disability, often within tribal programs, since 1973. In this podcast that this link goes to, she shares her experiences working alongside occupational therapists within Native American communities. She talks about how occupational therapy can benefit Native American communities, what she has learned from occupational therapists, and how occupational therapists can improve their services to Native American communities. So I'll definitely be sure there's listings on the titles of the episodes, and that's a really good tool, coming from somebody who has both the Indigenous background as well as that professional background and working on the ethnographic piece together. Some of the titles on there, you can see improving mealtime, what is occupational therapy, personal OT stories from working with different tribes. That's just an example. And I think I'll just tell you that website, and you can search that on there. It's KUNM, which is the University of New Mexico radio station. And so on there, it has the link. There's a Native American communities section. And so I think that's just the title, though. It's OT in Native American communities. And then there was one more that was more recent, I know I was going to share with you. There is a chapter, let me see, Occupational Therapy with Native American Youth. The name of that author is Maggie Hyman, Heyman hyphen Hotch, Hotch. And so that chapter, this is a chapter from a book, and she kind of goes into detail about, some of the stuff she studied when going into occupational therapy, and working on her capstone project when she was getting her master's. Some of the background for that was working with within a federally operated boarding school for Native American high school students, and kind of reflecting on that. Some of the stuff that they talk about within the realm of I guess you would say, racial justice in occupational therapy. She had studied on concepts of occupational justice, occupational apartheid, occupational deprivation, and then how that background, that historical background, led her to her work with current occupational therapy within Native American youth communities, both on the reservation and off the reservation. So again, that's a really useful tool right there. So that being said, those are some of the resources. Oh, thank you for putting that up there. Yeah, I'm really, I'm really bad at multitasking and like copying and pasting while I'm talking. So thank you. But yeah, so those are some really good points that are brought up there. And I think with that being said, in my personal opinion, how we need to figure out what's important to understand is that we are not a monolith. No community is a monolith by any means, but even within the Native American community, within the US, there are, I want to say 576 federally recognized tribes. There's about 100 more state recognized tribes. And then even getting into that, we have representation from tribal nations from Canada, Mexico, and other parts of Latin America. So with there being that many different tribes, there's that many different indigenous perspectives. There are quite a few things that we hold in common generally. And usually almost most tribal nations, tribal communities have a concept of the four directions. And the four directions not simply being northeast, south, and west. But what does this mean? How does this relate to this life cycle? Because for indigenous people, our epistemologies and our cultural lens for how we view the world is quite different from the Western lens. And when we think about Western ideology, time is a linear construct. It's like there is a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's like that with storytelling, with life, how we track, history. For indigenous people, time is cyclical. Time is cyclical. It's often why when you're listening to indigenous storytelling, there's not necessarily a beginning, middle, and an end. We might start at the end, and then we might go really far back to a different point, and then we're going to bring you back to the present, and then we're going to go back to the original beginning, and then what does that beginning mean for this community and that community? And so time is very cyclical, and that's how we view our life phases, kind of fit somewhere on the four directions. Now, traditionally, when you see a medicine wheel or four directions, you're going to see most of the time the colors black, white, red, and yellow. And I've heard some interesting explanations, and some people say, well, those represent the four races, and black, white, native, and Asian. And I'm like, that's slightly racist and also not accurate. But with that being said, not even all tribes use that. Some tribes have the color blue in there in place of one or the other. Like my tribe has the color blue on our color wheel, or on our medicine wheel. And then they also may mean different things. For some communities, they may do a traditional cross section like this, and you have one color in each of those quadrants. Some of them, tilt it, and it's a quadrant more like an X instead of a cross. And then the colors may be in different areas. Some may have white as the north, some may have black as the north. It varies depending on tribe. And what we have to remember is that for indigenous people, place and our connection to our point on the earth is very sacred. So everything having to do with that place has a significant meaning to us. And I always use a really good example of this is when we talk about different medicines, when we talk about different food. Me as an Apache person from the Southwest Texas, Mexico borderlands, the desert, cactus is very significant in every aspect of our lives. It's one of the most delicious things to eat. I literally just made it last night. I make it probably about 3 to 4 times a week. I'm not gonna lie. But so it has a very, nutritional importance to us. It has a medicinal purpose to us, the different parts of different types of cactus and how we use that. It can have ceremonial purposes, the tunas or the prickly pears, can be used in different ceremonial practices, can be used in food. And then it also will have a cultural significance and ties us to home. That's not going to mean anything to somebody who's Iroquois from, the Northeast. Just like things that are sacred to them won't mean much to me or to people from my community. And so taking that into consideration when you walk into any profession is that you need to have some of the basics understood, but to also make sure that the priority that you are giving, what you are giving priority to, is listening to that individual. Because if you have been working with people who are Pokagon, because you're doing a project in Michigan or South Bend area, and so you've been seeing nothing but Pokagon, you get really used to understanding their cultural lens and worldview. But then you may go out west, or you may move to a different area, and you're working with people who are Lakota. They're not going to have the same practices. There will be some things that are still very basic there. And here's a good example. I did find a resource that I was like, I'm going to use this as an example not to use, but also it could be a good teaching tool. When I was looking at this, there's this website called otdude.com. And it's and he has a section called Native American Barriers to Health for Occupational Therapy. One of the things starts off on a really good note, and it brings up some important factors to consider. It says Native American health outcomes are generally worse than those of the general U.S. population. Native Americans have higher rates of poverty and lower access to health care, all true, which can contribute to poor health outcomes. Specific health disparities that Native Americans face include higher rates of diabetes, heart disease, obesity, higher rates of suicide and substance abuse, higher infant mortality rates and lower life expectancy, higher rates of certain types of cancer, such as lung and liver cancer, higher rates of infectious diseases, such as tuberculosis. All important information. Additionally, Native American communities have been disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Very true. At the height of the pandemic, our community was dying at a higher rate from COVID than any other ethnic community. As a result, we also were getting vaccinated at the highest rate, which I love for us, that we were, we still had some people who were very big on the conspiracy theory train. But for the most part, we saw directly how this was affecting our communities, and we wanted to do something about it. So this site provides some good information, but one thing that I noticed is that it really quickly goes into some stereotypical information. And that's what I want people to be very careful about. One of the things they put on here, it says, some beliefs and traditions for this population include, number one, there is a single higher power known as Creator, Great Spirit, or Great One, among other names. This being is sometimes referred to in gendered form, but does not necessarily exist as one particular gender or another. There are also lesser beings known as spirit beings or spirit helpers. That is a bit stereotypical. Why is that? Creator is still a very Western word. Yes, it is used by a lot of people in our community, but this concept of a higher power, that doesn't very accurately describe Native spirituality and belief. And I'll speak from my own cultural lens. It's not a top-down process for us. That is pretty standard for Native people. It's not a top-down process. But from my own cultural lens, it's a symbiotic, reciprocal relationship that we have. Like, we believe that we have a duty and responsibility to our ancestors, to the earth, as they do to us. So it's not like we go out and how kind of like Western concepts of spirituality or religion is like you pray and you're asking for something, whether it be blessings or materialistic, whatever the case is, but you're asking for something. And for us, it's really not that. It is about making offerings to our ancestors, making offerings to our Mother Earth, but also our particular place in Mother Earth. So there are mountains that are extremely sacred to certain communities. For others, it might be a lake, it might be whatever, because it usually ties to our origin story, where we believe we came from, how we believe we emerged from the earth. And so considering it a higher power, something that has the ability to make things change in our life, that's a little bit of a generalization because for most Native communities practice accountability and kind of, basically, I'm responsible for my own destiny. I can thank those who came before me for allowing me to have this space and allowing me to be here, but my actions are what determine my outcomes. And that's not necessarily a higher power, but it's very symbiotic and kind of reciprocal. So that's something that to kind of steer away from. And then again, also, you may encounter people who come from tribes with multiple deities. Also, some of them may only have one, but this to generalize and say there's one creator, one great spirit, one, most tribes actually, the language, the word for creator actually translates to great mystery, because we're basically saying we don't really know what's out there, but we do want to acknowledge that something brought us here, so to speak. So it's almost like we're a little agnostic sometimes, I think. But but yeah, so that's something to keep in mind. Another thing is this site rightfully references plants and animals like humans are part of the spirit world. The spirit world exists side by side with and intermingles with the physical world. Moreover, the spirit existed in the spirit world before it came into a physical body, and will exist after the body dies. Sounds great. Yes, that can be true. Again, you may encounter people like the Hopi who believe in multiple worlds and multiple levels of worlds, and they have a very intricate belief system that plays directly into their everyday life. So, that being said, the reason why I wanted to reference that is when you're looking for information, it's really important that the information comes from a Native person, first and foremost. Secondarily, somebody who has done ethnographic, anthropological work within Native communities, and that you're always keeping in mind that it really is a learning curve. It really is about working with the person who's directly in front of you and not making assumptions, allowing them to kind of guide how you're going to do this, but making sure you ask those important questions. Like, you can even say, what are some cultural aspects that you really think I need to know in order to serve you better? I think about my own son, my son is on the autism spectrum. And so constantly, his whole life, occupational therapy was a part of what we had to work with on his IEP in school. Super bright kid, he's definitely like the high functioning, like, academic wise. He always struggled with his fine motor skills. And like, so his handwriting was really bad, and he always had trouble. He knew how to tie his shoes, but would he take the time to actually do it right? Almost never. And he would just leave them like that. And so we would work on things like that with his fine motor skills, and understanding that in certain Native communities, he's also hard of hearing. I'm sorry. So he has to have hearing aids. And they were like, we may get to the point where we want to talk about learning sign language, but so far he's doing okay. And that's something to consider is, there's a reason why it's called American Sign Language, and how you're going to, certain hand gestures, because hand talk is something that is very common in indigenous communities, especially since we worked with each other over vast geographical areas. That was usually how we communicated while we were learning the other tribe's language. And so understanding that certain gestures that may seem standard could be, considered offensive, or something that may be considered offensive, like in Western culture, is really something that's very important and sacred. And so always taking that time to ask those really important questions, working with that their family if need be, because that's another aspect to consider is indigenous people are very communal. So it is normal, more normal than I would say in Western culture, for multiple family members to be involved in developing care plans in any realm of healthcare.
Kind of going off of that as well, you're talking about being aware of everything. How do we better advocate for native cultural awareness and competency in the healthcare system that we currently abide in right now?
So what you guys are doing right now is awesome. I say, in any category of our lives, if you are serving Native people, then you need to go to the source. You need to go to Native people. When I talk about social and racial equity, it's if you're talking about something that impacts a particular community, you need to have somebody from that community at the table. So this is really great. A really great start is making sure, admitting that we need to learn something is the first step in order to be able to learn something. And so that's the first and foremost. And then just kind of reiterating what I said before, making sure that when you're looking at resources, how the practicum works, that you're looking primarily first at native sources. And it is easier if you end up living in an area where you are serving people who generally come from the same 1, 2, or 3 tribes, etc. It would be really beneficial to invest in working with the healthcare, the leaders of those clinics from those communities, attending any type of meetings that are open to the general public when they're talking about disparities or issues that are affecting their particular community. If you're in areas like ours, where we have people, I serve people from probably, I don't know, 70 different tribes, if I had to think about it, is working with an urban Indian organization. And then the Urban Indian Health Institute, I would just say, please keep that in your back pocket at all times. Like I said, given the fact that the majority of us are urban Indians, they have a plethora of data resources, constantly putting out, news bulletins and opportunities for people who are serving Native communities. So, I mean, yeah, I know I've kind of like hit on that stuff a lot, but that's really the most important thing, is making sure that Native voices and experience are included in, how you learn.
Just from everything you've talked about, which has been amazing just to hear, it's really interesting, especially about the statistics, how much they'd been skewed. If you had to estimate based on your experience and your time, how many urban natives live in Indiana? I know you just mentioned that there's so many people that come from different tribes, but if you had to throw a number out there with your best guess, how many do you think that there are?
I have that. And hold on, I have a thing saved from that. Let me go through my email, because this comes up so often, and you would think I would have this number memorized by now. But so we work with the National Urban Indian Family Coalition. We're part of that coalition and one of their grantees. And how it started was they approached us, I think it was, during the 2018 election. And we with them, we focus heavily on civic engagement and getting information out about, making sure Native people in the state know what their voting rights are. They know when their registrations are due. We get them registered. You would not believe it how many people think that if they have a felony that they're not allowed to vote. And I'm like, oh my God, that's not true. You can vote. And then as a result, the next thing that we worked on with them was the 2020 election, simultaneously the census. And Native Americans are have the highest undercount out of all communities. And so we worked really hard on that, to make sure that people were counted accurately. Also to make sure that that Native people who came from other communities, like in Latin America and Canada, were being included in that, and not labeled as other, and how that works. So that being said, we got census data and how that dramatically increased. I think before the census, people in 2020, people continued to say that we represented like less 1% of the population, and I think it's like now it's like 2.1 as a result of the census. But that's literally doubling our numbers. That still sounds so small, but that's literally doubling our numbers by making sure that people are accurately counted. For Indiana, the 2020 American Indian population. So this part unfortunately includes some people who self-identified, but this is a pretty good number. If we take into consideration people who self-identified, we're about 90,000. We're at about 90,000. Other estimates, including people, like I said, who self-identify, who may or may not, I think it puts us at closer to like 200,000, which sounds great. I'm gonna say we'll stick around the 100 mark, like for just to be more accurate. But we did have 180 in Indiana alone. We had an 180.4% increase. Oh, and I'm sorry, it's 2.1% of the population of Indiana, 2.9% nationally. So, and that was an 85.2% increase.
Just going off of that a little bit, I just want to recognize that you've mentioned this a couple times, so I want to kind of go further and have you explain it a little bit. But why are some tribes federally recognized versus like state recognized? And what do those distinctions really mean for the tribe? I mean, it could be healthcare wise or just in different aspects, just in general.
That is an amazing question. So I myself come from a state recognized tribe. The answer is multifaceted. Federally recognized means that you have federal recognition from the U.S. government as an Indian nation, that you have treaties with the United States. That doesn't mean that state tribes don't. So here's the problem. In different areas, it can mean different things. There are sometimes when I run into Oklahoma natives, that's not a dig, even though sometimes it sounds like it kind of is. But Oklahoma natives, I'll run into people who are from descendancy tribes who don't have blood quantum rules. You just have to trace an ancestor back to the rules. And most of these people tend to be predominantly racially white, but they're still native and they're still part of their tribe. But they have a problem with people who come from state recognized tribes, and they'll say this is not the majority of native Indian country by any means, but they'll say oh, you guys aren't legitimate tribes. Well, that's because in the East there are quite a few state recognized tribes that claim to be like, for instance, the Cherokee. There are only 3 legitimate Cherokee tribes, and they are federally recognized, and that's the largest one, which is the CNO, the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, and they do have a very, very white population. They do. And then there's the Katua Band of Cherokee in Oklahoma. They are a blood quantum tribe. Like, I believe you have to be 1/4 in order to be enrolled with them. And then there's ECBI in North Carolina, which is the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, and or EBCI, sorry. And so those are the 3 Cherokee nations. Now, they do have an issue where in different states there are these state recognized Cherokee nations that claim, well, we didn't go on the Trail of Tears, we remained here, and the state, for whatever reason, has found, given them legal status under the state. That's now in the West. That's not what our case is. In Texas, in California, we have a very unique history. Anybody who knows much about U.S. history knows that at one point we were the Republic of Texas and the Republic of California. And prior to that, we were Mexico. And prior to that, we were considered New Spain. And prior to that, we were just Indian territory, like we call like Texas Apache territory, because that's where we're predominantly from. Because of that, my tribe particularly has treaties with New Spain, with Mexico, with the Republic of Texas, with the U.S. And so there's a bit more complication. A lot of tribes in Texas and California will end up being either state recognized, and there's quite a few tribes in California that are non-recognized, but they are still tribally intact. They're still on their, traditional homelands. And it really, there's not a more simple answer than what is your relationship with the United States government? Again, that varies geographically. So, in Indiana, we don't have any federally or state recognized tribes, except with the exception of, there's the Pokagon presence, and then the Miami of Oklahoma. I do believe they have a cultural center here, but they're an Oklahoma tribe at this point because they were forcibly removed. And that's where some of that debate comes in from the federal recognized tribes, because they'll say, we left, we went through this excruciating history and had to be removed to this land. And so, if you guys were eligible to be, if the lineage is there, then you would be able to prove you're part of this tribe. So it's a really dicey subject, but it does mean that, we may be included in state recognized tribes, may be included in certain areas. like scholarships may be available depending on which organization is giving them out. Obviously, at our center, we service state and federally recognized tribal people, but it does mean it leaves us vulnerable. There are some protections there when it comes to ICWA, but we don't have the same level of protection, which ICWA is the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is currently on the chopping block with the Supreme Court. So that's something that we're all like on bated breath right now about. And then also when it comes to healthcare. Now, if you live in an area where there's an urban health center, chances are you're going to get served as a person who is from a state recognized tribe, but it means that we don't have our own IHS centers, and that we're not necessarily covered under IHS. And then even like with the state of Indiana, this is something that would probably be really important to all of you to know. Given that we don't have IHS, Indiana has this statute under Medicaid that means they have to legally provide coverage to Native American people, regardless of any other aspect. So when I first moved back up here from Miami, I hadn't started this job yet, but obviously I was like, oh my God, I have to have healthcare because of my kids. So I applied for Medicaid, like, you know, to make sure they're covered in the meantime. And they covered me. And I was like, really? I got covered too? And they said, well, yeah, because, you know, on the application you listed your tribal affiliation, and this law had been passed in the time that I wasn't living here. And I was like, oh, that's great. And so even when I got healthcare coverage and started my job, they're like, no, you're still covered, because they are not, there's a statute very specifically in there that they cannot consider income as a factor for denying you, because if you're Native, this is a treaty obligation. And so the state of Indiana has, you know, created a way around us not having IHS. But then a year later, I get a notification, and I didn't really even use it because, like I said, I had my own healthcare, but it was great to know that that was there as like secondary. And then a year later, I get a notification that I'm getting kicked off of it. And I was like, okay. And they say, because they decided that they weren't going to cover state recognized tribes, even though it's not written anywhere in their statute. With that being said, I still consistently have to go to bat for people. I had a student who was receiving Medicaid, and then she graduated and got a teacher's position, and they were trying to kick her off, and she was Navajo, and they were trying to kick her off because they said income. And I went through, I spent the whole night up highlighting every piece of this statute to show them that where it references Native Americans and how it says this is a class included with pregnant women and the medically frail that are exempt from all of these requirements. And I highlighted it, and they still they went in favor of the state on that. I think she was able to reapply later, but that's something that's a huge issue for people coming here, not having IHS, trying to get services, and people who work for Medicaid don't even know the law. So that is something to consider. I would always, if you run into Native people who don't have health coverage, I would, you know, you could refer them to us even and say, hey, you know, there's Medicaid for federally recognized Native people in this state. You know, that's something, but that's another area. So it is complicated, and it does make the work that much more harder when we're determining who gets, you know, certain protections and who doesn't.
That was really helpful. Jess, I know we're a little bit over, but that's okay because you've been sharing great information. I just wanted to ask if anyone else had any last questions or anything. Everything has been super helpful, and I'm really excited to be able to share all this information with the rest of the students and faculty at UND.
I don't know if there's anything else that anyone has like a burning question about, but I can, you know.
I mean, me personally, it's just so awesome being able to have like all these statistics in all these different formally published articles explaining some of these different aspects. So truly, thank you for like directing me. I mean, me personally, being able to direct to some of these articles where I can kind of explain some of the disparities that we kind of see within Indigenous communities. So sincerely, thank you for coming here today and just to kind of elaborate more on some of the um, difficulties that you and I experience, as well as trying to find ways in which we can create a more, a better community, one that, let's say, I think you can kind of relate to this, but it takes a village, it takes a village to raise a baby. And I feel like that is one of the biggest takeaways I got from within my community, in that, no matter who you are, you always make sure you look out for one another. You always make sure that whether it be an elder, whether it be anyone who is struggling, you give them a hand. And truly, I really appreciate you coming here today to support, like, give all of us these different resources so that way we can provide better culturally competent services. So truly, thank you, Carolina.
No, thank you guys so much for having me. I know it's and I apologize. I know I'm a hard person to get a hold of. Oh my gosh. But this is, I mean, this is just one of those examples, is that when you live in an area where we're not a significant portion of the population, anybody who works in our kind of field of advocacy, we are pulled in 1,000 different directions. Like, I just got an email while we were sitting here that I have to be at the State House on Monday to help with another, passage of a bill and whatnot. And so it's like, and that's just the thing, making sure that Native people are heard. I hear constantly people who want to do things for Native people, but they'll tell us how they want to do things for Native people, kind of like with the mascot issue. People are like, but we're honoring you. And I'm like, but did I say I want to be honored that way? Like, and it's just like, it's really about having autonomy and being a part of that. And I joke about it, but I'm very serious. When you're doing this work, any kind of healthcare work, don't be surprised if somebody brings in 3 or 4 family members to an appointment. We are very, very communal, and we do have that in most, and I always say most because, again, we're not a monolith, but for the most part, our worldview is, the benefit of the community over the individual. Like, we're not hyper individualism kind of like people. And so, yeah, so it is, and that's always something to, keep in mind when you're asking people questions, even if they do come alone, is like, hey, is there somebody else who should be involved in this kind of care plan for you? And like, what should we take into consideration? What is your role in your household or in your family?
It looks like that might be all the questions. Thank you again. This was so amazing. And thank you again to Bryant as well for getting us connected with you. This was awesome.
Also gonna, real quick, I'm gonna type in my email into the chat. So if there were any links that may not have been shared, or if there's just any questions that you may want me to follow up on, I'm gonna put it in there with the understanding, give me a couple business days to return, because I get so many emails every day, but I will get to you, I promise.
Thank you. I'll stay on a bit if anyone has any general COTAD questions for me, but we won't take up any more of your time. Carolina, thank you again. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so
Awesome.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina.
Thank you so much, Carolina.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.